The wind cut through Chicago's lower Wacker Drive like a blade. The boy, no older than 11, had stopped shivering an hour ago. His coat was a threadbare hoodie, hands tucked into his armpits. Cars streamed past without slowing. Then a lone Harley rumbled to a stop. The Hell's Angel preacher swung off and said, "You lost," the boy's voice cracked. "My sister's in the tunnel, she can't walk." What preacher found under the viaduct? A dying mother, two starving kids. No one else had bothered to look. That story changed everything for the boy, for the Hell's Angels, and for how an entire city saw its most invisible. But it almost didn't happen, because Preacher wasn't a hero that night. He was just a man who almost rode past. And the family he found wasn't just homeless. They were abandoned, written off by the very system meant to protect them. What unfolded over the next 48 hours would force an outlaw club to become an underground rescue network and expose a question none of us want to answer. How many kids are still standing on corners we refuse to see? To understand why that moment on Lower Wacker still echoes, you have to understand who Preacher was before that December night. His real name is Raymond Alvarez. 52 years old, ex-Marine, ironworker by trade, and a full-patch member of the Hell's Angels Chicago chapter for 17 years. On the road, they called him Preacher not because he was holy, but because he never shut up. He was the guy who'd lecture you about bike maintenance for an hour, then hand you the wrench and watch you do it yourself. Tough, loud, covered in ink. His neck bore the club's death head, his forearms a cemetery of names lost to prison, war, and the road. But if you asked his brothers, they'd tell you Preacher had a soft spot he tried to hide. He was the one who'd divert a ride to check on an old lady's heat, the one who carried extra blankets in his saddlebag in winter. He just never advertised it. That night, he was riding solo from a union meeting in the city, cutting through Lower Wacker to avoid the ice on the expressway. It was 17 degrees, wind chill pushing it down to maybe 5. He almost didn't see the boy. A small shape at the mouth of a service tunnel, not moving much, half swallowed by the steam rising from a vent. Preacher's first thought, panhandler. His second, that's a kid. He rode past 2 blocks before he cursed it out loud and circled back. He told me later it wasn't a decision. It was something his mother's voice said in the back of his head. "Raymond, you don't leave a child in the cold." That voice probably saved 3 lives. Meanwhile, the family huddled under that viaduct had already been failed by nearly everyone. Diane Carter was 43, a former nursing assistant who'd lost her apartment 8 months earlier after a diabetes complication cost her the job. She had 2 children, Marcus, 11, and Ania, 9. No father in the picture. No extended family willing to take them. For weeks they'd bounced between shelters, but most had wait lists or rules Diane couldn't navigate. You need ID, a referral, a clean drug test, a different intake appointment at a different office across town. When your blood sugar crashes and you can't see straight, bureaucracy becomes a death sentence. 3 times in the month before that night, Diane had called the city's homeless hotline. Twice, patrol officers had rousted them from underpasses and told them to move along. Nobody ran their names. Nobody asked if the kids had eaten. Marcus had learned to stop begging. He just stood still and waited, hoping someone would notice a child frozen in place. The Hell's Angels were the last people anyone expected to step in. For decades, law enforcement had painted them as a criminal syndicate, drugs, guns, violence. And sure, some of that was earned. But what the public never saw was the other side of the coin. The annual toy runs that raised 6 figures for children's hospitals, the back-channel networks that got veterans to VA appointments when bureaucracy stalled, the code of never turning your back on someone who needs help. That code wasn't written down. It was passed in bar fights and bike rallies, a quiet understanding that when you wear the patch, you're supposed to protect the unprotected. Preacher lived that code more than most. But even he never imagined testing it like this. When he swung off the bike and asked the boy if he was lost, Marcus didn't flinch. He just pointed toward the tunnel. The first thing Preacher saw was Ania sitting on a pile of wet cardboard next to a woman crumpled under a thin blanket. The woman was still, too still. Preacher knelt and felt for a pulse. Barely there. He checked her skin, cold and clammy. He knew enough first aid to recognize severe hypoglycemia when he saw it. The kids had been trying to wake her for 2 hours. Annia's voice was hoarse from crying. Marcus said the one thing that broke Preacher's heart. I didn't know who to ask. Preacher looked at the mother, at the two kids with no coats, and at the tunnel they'd called home for a week. He pulled out his phone, not to call 911, they'd been here before and nothing changed. Instead, he called the one number he trusted more than any government agency, his road captain. The words were simple. I need every brother who's sober and warm. We got kids going hypothermic under Wacker. The phone clicked. The rescue was already in motion. But before that rescue could arrive, Preacher had to do the one thing no agency had bothered to do: pick up a dying woman himself, carry her out of the dark, and demand that a city stop looking away. Preacher unzipped his leather vest, wrapped it around Diane's unconscious body, and lifted her out of the cardboard nest like she weighed nothing. Marcus and Annia followed, clutching each other, their breath puffing white in the dark. He walked them 2 blocks to a 24-hour diner he knew from late-night rides, a Greek place where the owner owed him a favor from a bar fight years ago. The owner, a man named Nikos, took one look at the woman limp in Preacher's arms and didn't ask a single question. He cleared a booth, cranked the heat, and sent a busboy to the pharmacy for glucose gel and test strips. Preacher laid Diane across 2 chairs, tilted her head back, and rubbed honey from the kitchen into her gums while they waited. Her blood sugar came back at 32 milligrams per deciliter. The pharmacist later said that was within an hour of fatal coma. Annia had stopped crying by then. She just stared at her mother's face, stroking her hand like she was trying to memorize it. Marcus sat with his back against the wall, watching the door, the way kids learn to watch doors when they've been moved along too many times. Within 20 minutes, the first rumble of motorcycles filled the street outside. Not 1 or 2, 12 of them. The road captain, a man named Sledge, had put out the call over the club's encrypted radio channel. Any member within 30 miles, you roll now. Lower Wacker, south entrance. We got a mother down and 2 children freezing. This is not a request. These were not the friendly charity ride bikers. These were the men the FBI had under active investigation. Men with records, men with reputations. But they showed up with blankets, propane heaters, and a medic named Doc who'd done 3 tours as an Army corpsman. Doc checked Diane's vitals, administered glucagon from his personal kit, and said the words that made everyone in the diner go silent. If you'd ridden past, she'd be dead by midnight. Preacher didn't answer. He just looked at Marcus, who was finally letting his shoulders drop, and something shifted in his chest, a lock turning, a decision hardening. But keeping them alive through the night was one thing. Finding them a place to stay was another. The shelters were full, and the Angels knew that the moment a uniform showed up, the family would be separated, processed, possibly charged with neglect. Preacher wasn't going to let that happen. He told Sledge, "Find me a roof. I don't care how." Sledge made one call to a club associate who owned a defunct dry cleaning shop on the south side. It had been boarded up for 2 years, no heat, no furniture. But the roof didn't leak, and the back room had a concrete floor that could hold warmth if you threw enough bodies and heaters at it. By 1 in the morning, a dozen Hell's Angels had broken into their own associate's building, with his permission, technically, and were hauling in space heaters, air mattresses, and a portable generator. Tank, the biggest of them, ripped the plywood off the windows from the inside and blacked them out with tarps so no one would report squatting. Doc set up an IV drip for Diane on a nail he hammered into a stud. Marcus and Annia got a double air mattress with flannel sheets that a member's wife had dropped off at 2 a.m., no questions asked. Preacher stood in the doorway of that cold, barren room, watching the kids finally close their eyes, and he realized something. The city had known about this family for months, and none of its systems had done what a dozen outlaws had done in a single night. That realization made him angry in a way he couldn't name. The next morning, the Angels went to war with the system, not with fists or guns, but with phones and paperwork. Preacher called the Department of Children and Family Services and identified himself as the person reporting 3 prior complaints that had been closed without action. He had the case numbers because he'd made Marcus recite them in the diner. The boy had memorized every one. The operator tried to transfer him. Preacher demanded a supervisor. When the supervisor said they'd look into it within 5 business days, Preacher said, "I'll bring 60 bikes to your office in 2 hours and we'll wait in the lobby. How many cameras you want that on?" The supervisor's tone changed. A caseworker arrived at the storefront by noon. She found Diane conscious but weak, hydrated, clean, 2 kids in new clothes, and a room full of men with felony records who had somehow become the most competent social workers in the city. The caseworker, to her credit, realized the optics and did her job. She fast-tracked an emergency housing voucher. But the real shock came when she looked at the notes on her tablet and said, "This address, an abandoned shop, it's listed as unfit for human habitation. You can't legally shelter them here." Preacher leaned in and said, "Ma'am, it was this or a concrete tunnel. Choose." What happened next is the pivot nobody saw coming. Instead of backing down, the Angels decided to fix the problem themselves, legally. Sledge called a club brother who owned a contracting business. Another brother was a licensed electrician. A third had connections at a building supply yard. By that afternoon, they were drawing up plans to convert the dry cleaning shop into a temporary residential safe space, not just for Diane, but for anyone the system had failed. They called it the Nest. No red tape, no waiting lists, no drug tests for mothers who just needed a warm floor and a locked door. The rule was simple: if you're with kids, you're in. Preacher put up $5,000 of his own retirement money to start the renovation. The road captain matched it. Within 3 days, they had running water, a working bathroom, and a kitchen that could feed 20. Word spread through the homeless camps not through flyers but by whispers. Go to the Angels on King Drive. They don't ask for ID. They just ask how many. Families started showing up. By the end of the week, the Nest had taken in 4 more mothers and 7 children. All of them had been previously reported to the city. None of them had been helped. But the bigger the operation grew, the more the city pushed back. The building wasn't zoned for residential use. Code enforcement got an anonymous tip, likely from a rival club or a spooked alderman. An inspector showed up on day 8 and slapped a cease and desist order on the door. When Preacher asked him what the alternative was, the inspector shrugged. That night, the Angels had a choice: disband the safe house and send the families back to the streets, or defy the order and risk arrest. Preacher called a meeting in the back room, just the core 10 men. He laid out the stakes. We could all catch charges. Trespassing, health code violations, maybe worse. They'll say we're running an unlicensed shelter, that we're endangering the kids. And the media will eat it up. Hell's Angels running a flophouse. What else is new? He paused, looked around at the hardened faces, and then he said, "Or we could call a press conference of our own, stand in front of that building with the mothers and the kids, and dare the city to shut it down on camera." The vote was unanimous. They chose the camera. And that decision would turn a quiet act of mercy into a national firestorm, one that would force a mayor to answer a question nobody was ready for. If the Hells Angels are housing the homeless, what exactly are you doing? The press conference happened on a Tuesday. Preacher stood in the slush outside the dry cleaning shop with a dozen bikers flanking him and 5 mothers holding their children behind him. He didn't read a statement. He just pointed at the boarded windows, at the children in donated coats, at the cease and desist order taped to the door, and said into the microphone, "This building is illegal because we don't have a permit. But the viaducts are illegal too. The underpasses are illegal. Nobody's shutting those down. So tell me why we're the bad guys." The local news stations aired it at 6 and 10. By midnight, the clip had been shared 60,000 times. The city woke up to a crisis it didn't know how to spin. But instead of backing down, the city doubled down. The next morning, the Department of Buildings issued a second citation, this time for unauthorized occupancy of a commercial structure. A police lieutenant, not a beat cop, personally delivered it with 2 squad cars. He told Preacher that if the families weren't out by the end of the day, they'd start making arrests. Preacher folded the citation, put it in his vest pocket, and said, "You do what you gotta do. We'll do what we gotta do." The lieutenant paused, looked at the mothers behind him, and for a moment his expression flickered, not anger, something closer to shame. But he left, and the deadline stood. That was when the mothers decided they weren't going anywhere. Diane, still weak but now fierce, walked outside with an old piece of cardboard and a marker. She sat down on the frozen curb and wrote in big, shaky letters. MYKIDS were invisible until OUTLAWS saw THEM. She held it above her head, refusing to speak, just letting the cameras do the work. Another mother, a woman named Keisha who'd fled domestic violence, stood beside her with her toddler on her hip. She didn't shout. She just said to a reporter, "You want to arrest me? Go ahead. But you gotta arrest my son too. He's 3. The cameras zoomed in. The footage spread everywhere. Suddenly it wasn't just bikers versus the city. It was mothers daring the city to criminalize their survival. The police didn't come back that day. The deadline passed without a single squad car. The optics were too brutal. Arresting a 3-year-old on the evening news was not a look any precinct captain wanted on their record. But the quiet war didn't stop. It just moved behind the scenes. The club's national leadership got a call from a lawyer they retained, an expensive one who didn't normally represent bikers. The message was grim. The city was building a case for criminal nuisance, and they were threatening to escalate to federal charges under the RICO statute if the club didn't distance itself from the shelter. The implication was clear. If Preacher kept pushing, the entire Chicago chapter could be targeted. Some of the club's older members, the ones who'd survived the 80s and 90s when RICO was used to decimate dozens of clubs, started getting nervous. A call came from the national vice president. "Raymond, you're doing good work, but you're painting a target on every brother in the Midwest. You need to find a way to hand this off to a church or a nonprofit, something clean, before the feds use it as a pretext to raid us." Preacher listened, didn't argue, hung up, and then turned to Sledge. "We're not handing them off. We're building 10 more nests." He was willing to risk his patch, his freedom, his brother's freedom, because he'd seen Marcus's face when he finally fell asleep. That was the point of no return. The story, however, had already outgrown the street. A national morning show picked it up. A celebrity philanthropist, the kind who reads about heartwarming stories on her social feed, called the club directly and wired $100,000 to a temporary escrow account with instructions. "Make this legal. I'm matching whatever you raise." The money arrived on a Friday. By Sunday, the Angels had hired an architect, a zoning attorney, and a PR consultant who'd once worked for a senator. The narrative flipped. What started as an outlaw operation was now being framed as a bold, necessary intervention that had shamed the city into action. The mayor's office, sensing a political landmine, issued a statement. "We are grateful to all community members who step up for the vulnerable, but we must also ensure safety and regulation." It was a weak dodge, and the public pounced on it. A viral hashtag emerged, #OutlawsDoingYourJob. The mayor's approval rating dipped 6 points in a week. Then came the revelation that changed everything. A local investigative reporter, digging into the city's homeless services, discovered that over the previous 3 years, more than 20 children had been reported as living on the streets in the precincts surrounding Lower Wacker. Not one of those reports had resulted in emergency housing. Some had been closed as unable to locate. Others had been marked resolved without a single follow-up visit. The reporter compared those numbers to the 2 weeks since the nest opened. 9 families sheltered, 17 children off the streets, 0 arrests, 0 emergencies. The data was undeniable. The system had been failing on purpose, either through negligence or deliberate underfunding, and a motorcycle club had outperformed it in 14 days. That article didn't just go local. It went national. The Department of Justice, which had been quietly investigating the Hells Angels, suddenly found itself in an uncomfortable position. The same group they'd labeled a criminal enterprise was now being held up as a model of community care. The mayor, cornered, did what politicians do when the ground collapses under them. He called a press conference of his own. Standing in the City Hall rotunda, flanked by 3 aldermen, he announced a new public-private partnership named Compassion Chicago, which would allocate $2 million in emergency funds to create rapid response shelter pods across the city. He thanked the Hells Angels for their inspiration, but carefully didn't mention the nest by name, and offered no funding to the club itself. Preacher watched the announcement on a laptop in the back room of the dry cleaning shop, surrounded by mothers folding laundry and children doing homework. He didn't cheer. He just said, "That money'll get tied up in committee for 6 months. We'll still be here." He was right, but something had shifted. The city had been forced to respond, and now the question was no longer whether the Hells Angels could run a shelter. It was whether the city would ever truly partner with the men they'd once tried to criminalize, or just wait for the cameras to leave. The answer would define the next chapter of The Nest, and the fight was just beginning. The mayor's press conference bought the city 6 weeks of good headlines. Then the cameras left, and the money didn't move. Compassion Chicago's $2 million got routed through 3 committees, a feasibility study, and a community impact assessment that was supposed to take 30 days but stretched to 90. Meanwhile, Preacher and his crew didn't wait. They took the $100,000 donation and bought the dry cleaning shop outright. Cash. No mortgage. The zoning attorney found a loophole. If the building served as a private clubhouse with residential caretaker quarters, it could operate while they fought for formal reclassification. A judge, perhaps embarrassed by the national coverage, granted a temporary injunction against the cease and desist order. The Nest was legal on a technicality, but it was legal. By the end of winter, they had running hot water in all 4 bathrooms, a commercial kitchen donated by a restaurant supplier who'd seen the story, and a classroom space where retired teachers volunteered to tutor the kids. The mothers in residence formed their own council and made house rules. They didn't need the angels to manage them. They needed the angels to protect them from a system that had already written them off. Preacher gladly stepped back into the role of security and logistics, letting the families run their own recovery. The club funneled its muscle into a formal network they called Angels Reach. To avoid the RICO threat, Preacher and Sledge created a separate nonprofit with a civilian board, a pastor, a nurse practitioner, and the same PR consultant who'd flipped the narrative. Club members could volunteer, donate, and serve on the board's advisory council, but the legal firewall kept the operation clean. Within 6 months, Angels Reach had expanded to 3 locations: the original Nest on King Drive, a former church rectory in Inglewood, and a vacant firehouse in Humboldt Park. Each site operated under the same rule: no questions about past evictions or addiction or time served, just a simple threshold. If you've got kids and nowhere safe to sleep, the door opens. They moved 35 families off the streets that first year. 47 children who had been sleeping in cars, on trains, under bridges now had beds and hot meals every night. The city's own shelter system, meanwhile, reported only 11 new placements in the same period. The numbers were a continuing indictment. Diane Carter got her health back. With stable housing and regular meals, her blood sugar stabilized. She enrolled in a 6-month medical assistant certification program at a community college, paid for by the club's scholarship fund. Marcus started 5th grade at a school 3 blocks from the Nest and joined a chess program run by one of the volunteers. He told a local reporter, "I don't stand on corners anymore. Now I just walk home." Ania, who had barely spoken for weeks after the rescue, began drawing pictures of motorcycles with angel wings. She gave one to Preacher, who had it tattooed on his forearm, right above the names of his fallen brothers. He told me it was the first tattoo he ever got that made him cry. The unexpected pivot came from the one man nobody expected. The police lieutenant who had personally delivered the second citation, a 20-year veteran named Brian Costello, showed up at the Nest on a Saturday morning 6 months after the standoff. He wasn't in uniform. He brought a casserole his wife had made and a cardboard box of children's books. He asked to speak to Preacher privately, and the 2 of them sat on the back steps for an hour. Costello said that after the press conference, he couldn't stop thinking about what Diane had written on that piece of cardboard. He'd spent his career enforcing codes and clearing camps, and not once had he ever asked where the people were supposed to go. He said, "My own kids had a warm bed every night, and I was out here telling mothers with bobbies that they couldn't sleep in an abandoned store. I couldn't live with that anymore. He retired from the force 3 weeks after that conversation. Then he came back to the nest as a full-time volunteer, not for a paycheck, there wasn't one. He just started showing up every morning to cook breakfast. The mothers were skeptical at first, but Diane, the woman he'd once tried to evict, was the first to sit down and eat with him. That gesture, that quiet forgiveness, became the living symbol of what the nest was actually building. Not just shelter, but a way back. By the 2-year mark, Angel's Reach had sheltered over 100 families. Preacher and his core team trained volunteers in other cities, Detroit, St. Louis, Milwaukee, to replicate the model. The club's national leadership, initially nervous, embraced the program as proof that the Hells Angels were more than their rap sheet. The branding was messy, but the results were undeniable. A University of Chicago study later found that families who went through the nest had an 87% rate of stable housing after 1 year, compared to 32% in the city's traditional shelters. When the data came out, the mayor's office quietly reached out to negotiate a contract. The city would fund Angel's Reach, but they wanted the name changed and the biker branding removed. Preacher refused. He said, "The logo stays. If that's a problem, we'll keep doing it for free and you can keep explaining why you're not." The city blinked. The first government grant arrived 18 months after the rescue for $300,000. It was a fraction of what the city spent on failed shelters, but it was a start. And through all of it, Preacher never took credit. He pointed instead to that one moment on Lower Wacker Drive. He said, "I almost rode past. I had that boy in my mirror for 2 seconds before I stopped." That's how thin the line is between remembering his face for the rest of my life and reading about him in a coroner's report. The frozen vigil that had lasted 2 hours, ignored by hundreds of cars, ended not with a city agency or a professional social worker. It ended with a man on a Harley who wasn't sure why he turned around. That one act of uncertain kindness cracked open a door that had been sealed for decades. The question is whether the rest of us will walk through it. Here, what I can't stop thinking about. That boy stood on Lower Wacker for 2 hours in the freezing dark. Hundreds of cars passed him. Commuters, cabs, people who probably call themselves good folks. Not one of them stopped. Not one. The only person who did was a man with a death head on his back and a record the FBI kept in a folder. And he almost didn't. He had the kid in his mirror for 2 seconds and nearly kept going. That is how thin the line actually is. Not between good and evil, but between noticing and looking away. Preacher tells people now that he's no hero. He says he just couldn't live with the face he'd see in the mirror if he rode on. And I think that's the thing we forget. The system fails all the time. It failed Diane. It failed Marcus, Ania, but systems are made of people, and people can choose. Every one of those drivers had the same chance. They just took the other option. So I have to ask you. Not the version of you that you want to be, but the real you, the one who's tired after a long day, who's got places to be. Would you have stopped? Would you have swung off that bike or pulled over that car and walked into a dark tunnel for a stranger? Be honest. The answer matters more than you think. Because somewhere tonight, there's another kid on another corner, and the only thing that will find him is a person who decides that fear or convenience isn't a good enough reason to look away. If this story moved you, if you believe that one yes can change a life, then do something small right now. Drop a heart in the comments, subscribe so the next story finds you, and share this with someone who's forgotten that quiet kindness still exists. Because the door Preacher opened is still open. All it takes is someone willing to walk through.